All right, welcome back. So in our last lesson, we talked a little bit about how to read lines of code, meaning we have a block of code that we're given. We don't fully understand what that block of code on its own does. And so we need to kind of use some techniques to try to understand what's going on, what the different parts mean, things like that, right? So the first step of the things that we learned was how to read lines of code. Now, sometimes those lines of code are not going to be totally on their own. They're not going to be totally standalone lines of code where we can just read that one line, that one line or the 5 lines or whatever and understand what's going on. There might be some dependencies on other parts of the application. The other part of this is that sometimes we can totally understand what a function does, but we don't understand what its context is in the larger picture. Or maybe it calls out to some other function that does something else, and that function calls to other functions that do other things, and so on and so forth. So we need to start to build a picture of what's going on at a bigger level. So the second set of things that we're going to talk about is reading. We'll call this, we're going to say methods or classes or files. So this is kind of our second level up on this chain. And as a reminder, our third level was going to be reading code bases. Code base, if you haven't heard that term, is like a collection of files and classes and things like that. But what we're going to be talking about today is this second step. How do we read methods, classes, files? How do we read this kind of middle of the road where we need to know a little bit more detail of what's going on with a particular class, right? All right. So we're going to be using an example today of some example code that I've written, and we're going to use that code to try to go through a few different steps. So the first step we're going to go through, the first step in reading methods, classes, files, the first step is to find a starting point. Okay, so we're gonna try to figure out where we're going to start from. From there, we are going to find, and in our case, we're going to actually start to map these out. And we'll show you what that looks like. We're going to start to find and map important variables, okay, so important variables, or maybe the parameters that are being passed into a method, or maybe even methods that are really important. We're going to start to find the really important things there. So that's the first thing we're going to do. We're going to keep track of the input and output. Largely, we call this like a data flow. In general, later on, when we talk about this third level up where we're trying to map out entire code bases, we'll start to look into this a little bit more. And then for each of these, for other functions that are called, that's the third one, is function calls. So when a function, or a method calls a different function or method, we're going to start to map those out as well. And we're going to do, for each of these, we're going to repeat this over and over until we've started to build out a map of what's going on. All right, so let's take a look at this sample code base that I've come up with. This is a pretty simple file of code. It's only about 30 lines. I cut off some headers just to make it a little bit easier to read. We have a little bit of comments, and maybe we can start to understand what some of these things are doing. But let's start to, rather than breaking down individual lines of code, let's start to try to understand how these are going to fit together. So what was our first step? Let's go back here. Our first step was going to be to find a starting point. So in some programming languages, finding a starting point is going to be easier than others. In something like JavaScript, we actually mark specific methods as export or not export. Java is also this way. You've seen probably some methods are marked as public versus private or protected. Python unfortunately doesn't have that, but one thing you will see with Python sometimes is that things will have like an underscore in front of their name. So maybe this would be def_balance_groups. This is not a case where that has happened, but that could be an indication to you that something is unimportant. If it starts with an underscore for its name, it's often unimportant. Now, let's take a look at these and see what are some important ones. So assuming we don't have that underscore thing to go on, which we don't have in this case, what are some other things that we might look at to see if something is important? Well, first of all, really, really short methods often tend not to be a good starting point. So this one is probably not a good starting point. We can just go ahead and right away, we'll just write this off. This one's not going to be our starting point. These other two maybe are a little bit more complicated. So we get this one called balances a list of lists so that they are roughly equally sized. This method says it makes even-ish groups of size group size and returns an array of the players. Now, which one of these sounds like it probably does a higher level goal, right? What is the one that's going to do a more broad, kind of bigger picture, like kind of important to the application level thing versus a more niche application of like some particular small feature of the application? Which of those two do you think is a bigger picture method? So I would say of these two, I think that make groups is the bigger picture one. Now there's another thing that is a thing that we have going for us here that we can kind of take a look at as well, which is that you can see that this make groups function, actually down here, it calls balance groups, right? You can see that this one actually calls balance groups. Balance groups, on the other hand, does not call make groups. So that's another thing that we could kind of use to see, like, if this is a function that mostly calls other functions, that could be a good indication for us for a starting point as well. So when we look at a file of code, and we'll make a new slide here, right? So we have a new file of code finding a starting point. Some of those tips that we came up with were, right, we have ignore really short methods. Right? Look for like higher level things. Oh, sorry. Actually, we have one more before that, didn't we? We also had ignore private methods, if your language has that, or in Python, underscore methods. Right? And again, these underscore methods, what we're talking about is the ones that are like def my method. Right? So the ones that start with an underscore, those tend to be less important because they're not the ones that other things would use. And then failing that, like look for higher level functionality, or methods that call lots of other methods. And we're talking specifically about methods that call lots of other methods in our code base. So if it's calling like, you know, map or something like that, like some function, right? Some function that's built into your programming language. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about methods that call lots of other methods in our code base. That's kind of what we're looking for with the starting point. Now in here, we've identified that, that's not a good starting point. That's not the best starting point. So this is going to be our starting point. We'll go ahead and erase this up here. All right, so this is going to be our starting point. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start on our mind map. So I'm going to just go ahead and I'm going to write out the name of this method, make groups. Make groups. And I will draw this. You can kind of use whatever format you want as long as you feel like you understand it. We're going to call this make groups. And first of all, we're going to take a look at what the data that make groups takes into it. So it takes players and group size. So it takes as input players. And it takes as input group size. Okay, so those are both inputs. Are there any variables in here that look really important? We don't have any maybe groups down here, right? So we have this thing called groups. And groups calls out to this chunk, right? So let's go back here and we'll maybe say important variable. Right, we have groups. And groups was, we can add some notes for ourselves here, right? So groups came from this chunk function. Okay, so we got that important variable. Are there any other important variables? I don't see any variables really at all that are being set here, so that's okay. And what are other functions that we're calling here? So we're calling balance groups. So do a little arrow there over to this, and we'll do the same for this function. So we have balance groups. Okay. So you have balance groups over here. And what about balance groups? Well, that takes as input groups. All right. And what does that return? So this is where we get back into reading lines of code. This code looks a little bit complicated, and we'll have to kind of go through it and figure out what's going on. Now, luckily, we already kind of figured out some of this. We were talking about list comprehension earlier, and we can see sum. So this is going to be the number of players let's see, for each group in groups, we get the length of that group, and then we sum it all together. So this is the number of players total. I know I went through that a little fast. Again, this is a skill, totally okay if it takes you a little bit longer. Now, min group size. That's pretty, that variable kind of describes what it does on its own, right? So, and we can kind of see from here, it's taking the number of players and it's dividing it by the length of the groups, and it's calling int. And maybe we don't fully understand what this int call is doing, but we can ignore that for right now. We're basically saying we're dividing the number of players up by the length of the groups, right? So if there are 100 players and 10 groups, then we know that there's going to be 10 players in each group if we get to the right size. Okay, what about this groups ARR is list enumerate groups? That's kind of weird, right? Let's just kind of ignore this for right now because it doesn't seem super important. Groups ARR is probably short for array, so it's an array of groups. So we're kind of doing something to the array to make it into something else. If this becomes important later, we can always come back to it. All right, so we can kind of figure out what this line is doing. It's a for loop, and we're saying for each group, and we have the number of the group. And then down here we're saying, well, the length of the group is less than the minimum group size, so the ideal group size. So while we have too few people, right? We have too few people. Okay, so for group steal in groups array, and the indexes are not the same, and group steal has more than the minimum number of players, then we append. We have to look up what pop means, but we can say, okay, like we need to take this group that we're stealing something from. We can kind of tell from the variable name, and we're taking something out of it and we're putting it into our group. So this entire thing is basically saying move people from bigger group to smaller group. And then over here we have this weird line of code, and we're just going to ignore it for right now. That's totally fine, because I think that this comment right here kind of gives us enough of a picture to understand roughly what this code does. We don't need to know every single thing about our code. We just need to know roughly what's going on. And this is giving us enough information to know roughly what this balance groups function is probably going to do. So we can leave a comment here, and we'll say that our balance groups thing moves players into equally sized groups. All right. And now that we know that, we can go back to our make groups function, and we'll take a look. What are the other functions that this one calls? Well, it also calls chunk down here, right? Now, random.shuffle is built into Python. Length is built into Python. We're not going to document the ones that are built into Python. We're only going to document the ones that are not built into Python, the ones that our code base actually has. And if you're not sure, you can always look it up. So down here we have this chunk function, and that's this one up here. So we'll go out in here and we'll draw another thing for chunk. Right, so we have this chunk function up here. Let's I'll make this a little bit more accurate of an arrow. There we go. Chunk. And what are the arguments that chunk takes? Chunk takes a list and a number. So it takes a list and it takes a number. Or n, but n is usually short for a number. And we don't really need to read the code here to figure out what's going on, because this comment explains it well enough. It breaks a list into chunks of size n. So if we have a list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we give it that list and we give it 2, it's going to break it into 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So, breaks, we can write this however we want. So this is only for your own reference. 2, 3, 4, 5 into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Where n is equal to 2. All right, so now we're starting to understand kind of what this function actually does and how everything fits together. Now, why was all of this important? Maybe we don't actually care about how balance groups work. Maybe we don't actually care about how chunk works. But the important thing here is that we're starting to get a picture of how everything fits together, so that if we need to make a change, we're able to make that change. So let's say, for example, that we wanted to write a test for this file, right? We wanted to test how make groups works. Now, the easiest thing to do would be to just directly test make groups itself, right? But that can actually be pretty complicated because make groups probably does a bunch of different things. And in fact, we know it does a bunch of different things. But now that we have this map, we can start to see, okay, well, I can add a test to chunk itself. And that will help us get a little bit more of an idea to figure out whether or not chunk is performing properly. So that if there's a problem with make groups, we know whether or not it's coming from chunk. We can start to figure out, if I need to add something to this file, where would I do it? So maybe we need to add the functionality for people to have different ratings, right? And maybe they get placed in a group with other people with a similar rating. So like if this is for a competition, maybe we want people with a similar seed to be next to each other, right? Like you want the really good players playing the other really good players. Or maybe you don't. Maybe you want the opposite, right? Well, where would we do that in this diagram, right? If we want to start to make a change to how these groups are being balanced, it's probably going to be in here, right? So we're probably going to make our change in here. So let's, I'll highlight this in yellow, right? So we're going to need to make a change here in balance groups. But we'll also probably need to make a change over here because we'll need to keep track of those rankings. Right now, we don't, we're not keeping track of those rankings potentially. So we need to make sure that this players object has information about how good the player is. And that's going to need to be passed all the way through over here. How good they are needs to be passed all the way through this function, all the way over to here, so that balance groups has access to that information about how good the player is, and they can, use that for balance. So that's an example of why we want to make these maps, is because once we're starting to make changes to certain files, you're going to need to figure out where those changes are going to be made. And this is where we start to get into making those decisions. At one point in this course, we're going to have you create one of these maps for a file that you think you need to change. And you're going to present it to your mentor along with your suggested changes for where things are going to be. So that'll be sort of this like adding information about how good the player is and, passing it all the way through over here to balance groups. That's the sort of thing that you're going to need to do. Okay, so I did want to talk about one more sort of advanced technique here. Sometimes it's just really hard to figure out what's going on in really complicated files. So one thing you can do there is use a debugger. And if you haven't used a debugger, it's a skill that's a little bit outside the scope of what we're going to talk about in this course. But basically the idea behind a debugger is that if you have these, these lines of code, so you have these lines of code, what we can do is we can actually tell the computer to stop on a certain line of code by putting a little, basically putting a little red dot there. So let's say that I'm really confused by this for loop. It's complicated. You got a loop within a loop, and there's another loop, and then there's an if, and it's like 3 levels of loops, and I'm like really confused about what this is doing. What I can do is in a debugger, I can put a little, a red dot there basically. And that is usually the way it works. You usually click next to the line number and it puts a red dot there. And then when you are ready to run your code, instead of clicking the normal like play button, most of the time near the play button, there's a little image of like a bug. And if we click this bug instead of the play button, what will happen is that every time the code gets to this line of code, even if that happens multiple times because it's in a loop, the program is actually going to pause, and you'll be able to see the values of every individual variable in that code. If you haven't done this before, it's a little bit outside of the scope of what we're going to be doing here, but the general idea is that by using this debugger, you can kind of maybe get a better intuition for what's going on with a method or where control is going or things like that. And we'll link to a tutorial on debuggers. Now, for many of the open source projects that you're going to need to use, you will not need to use a debugger. But if you do need to use a debugger, come back to this video and take a look at the tutorial we're going to post on how to use a debugger. And I think that'll be helpful for you as well. All right, so again, the end result of what we've come up with here is a map of what's going on in a file. We've used the skill that we learned before about reading lines of code. The next and last part of this puzzle is going to be looking at the entire code base and figuring out what files do you even need to open? What files are going to be the relevant ones for you to look at? What are going to be the things that you care about? And that'll be the next lesson. So thanks so much for joining us.